This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I've been going down this path a lot recently, taking into account AI, but also taking into account us. And my guest today, Michael S. Malone, author of The Autonomous Revolution, Reclaiming the Future We've Sold to Machines. Michael does a great job of winding us through the understanding of where, the how this autonomous revolution has come upon us and what we can do to survive it. And he really makes the case that, hey, if we don't stand up, if we don't step up, we're going to have potentially really big trouble. Now, one of the things that's so cool about Michael, and I could talk to him for hours and hours and hours, the first daily major newspaper reporter in Silicon Valley, going back to, I think, the early 80s, late 70s, he's had a chance to speak to everyone except one person. And I do ask him about that on the podcast. But this is a guy who actually went to grade school with Steve Jobs. So interesting to talk with someone who's had the chance to watch Silicon Valley, to watch the digital revolution up close and personal, and to talk to so many of the names that we all know. And Michael's had a chance to get to know many of them on a personal level. I'm always so fortunate on this podcast to talk to such interesting people, interesting careers. I really feel like this podcast is a part of history. Yes, a small part of history, but what I feel like I am doing is curating a group of guests that don't exist on any other show. I've enjoyed putting together a wide cross-section of voices, often really high achievers, maybe not as famous as some of the guests that get to go on Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss, but brilliant nonetheless. Without any further diatribes from me and looking at the cover of The Autonomous Revolution, let's jump right into my guest today, Michael S. Malone. What a fun perspective, though. Do you sometimes ever just pinch yourself like, what a fun ride? I mean, you know, and I can't do it today, but I could pick your mind on untold numbers of topics and individuals going back decades, and you would have some interesting perspective on a lot of them. I tell you what, before we even jump into your content today, are there a couple individuals, and you don't have to give a long, spiel or anything, but are there a couple individuals that you just really, in terms of you're meeting them, you're being impressed, the individuals in Silicon Valley that you really had a chance to be around, where you just still to this day are in absolute awe of them as individuals?
Yeah, there's several. One of them is obviously David Packard. Another one is Bob Noyce. Bob Noyce was absolutely as charismatic as anybody has ever said he was. There are certain people, they go into a room, the room just vibrates. I think the third one, even though he and I didn't get along at all, was Steve Jobs. I actually went to elementary school with Steve Jobs, and I was the first daily reporter to cover Apple. I watched him and Woz and Fernandez buying the parts for the Apple I at the local hobby store about 3 blocks from my house. I mean, I go back to the very beginning of Apple.
Can I share really quickly my one meeting Woz story? I'm leaving Saigon on a red eye. I'm with my parents. They're in their 70s. We're sitting in the business class lounge. It's 12 a.m. Some guy taps me on the shoulder and says, "Can I split your power plug?" And he's got this big splitter. So I look at him and immediately recognize him. And I say, "Sure, as long as I can get a selfie." So I take a selfie with him. He turns around, starts working on what he's doing. No one knows who he is. And it was a couple of years ago. And my father looks at me like, "What are you doing? Who are you taking a selfie with?"
And then he saw Dancing with the Stars.
Crazy, huh?
Woz, very interesting guy. I see Woz all the time. I've known him forever. In fact, I have a story. When I was helping Regis McKenna's wife and a guy from the Sunnyvale City Council run for the county supervisors. I was doing the PR for him. So we held a party at the Wozniak's house, a fundraiser. And I'm standing there talking to people and all that. I look in the backyard and there's Regis McKenna out there with Mr. Wozniak. 30 years later, I was having coffee with Regis and I said, "What the hell were you guys talking about?" And he said, "Oh, Mr. Wozniak was saying, you got to help me, Regis. My son is under the spell of this scary, charismatic character that's manipulating him named Steve Jobs. You've got to help me separate the two of them." And that's Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in a nutshell.
I love watching his old interviews, Wozniak's old interviews. They're just so interesting. He's such a geek and such an interesting geek, and he just gets right into the nitty gritty. I love it.
He'd work on stuff and he'd concentrate so deeply. He told me once that he actually dreamed in assembly code at one point. He's really the Mozart of computers, but he would get so deep in concentration, his mother would come in and rap him on the top of the head to get his attention.
I might have to twist your arm for a second conversation, completely different topic area at some point in time.
How long we got on this?
Look, I'm free. It's my morning. I'm wide awake.
Just go for it, whatever you want to talk about.
Tell you what, though, I do want to start with, I'd love to kind of go down the Wozniak trail, but I'm not as prepped as I want to be today. But I saw something the other day, and I thought it was a great jumping off point as to where your current writing is right now, at least the book that I'm looking at right now, The Autonomous Revolution. There's this new app that apparently law enforcement are using. I've already tested something like this online where I can take my picture to a search engine, a picture off my phone, put it onto a search engine. It tells me who I am. It scans the pictures. But basically, it's some app. Essentially, it's previewing what we're probably all going to have access to before they make it illegal, if they ever do, which is if you're walking down the street, you see somebody, let's say you're some guy and you see a pretty girl, you take her picture, you look at your phone, it tells you her name and where she lives. That is, I think, in many ways,
it's a perfect stalker tool.
But I mean, I think it opens up Pandora's box on where you're going with the autonomous revolution. This is a byproduct of it.
Yes.
That's frightening. And I think that might be the kind of thing that pushes people to listen more.
How old are you?
51.
Okay. Go talk to a 20-year-old if they're concerned about all this surveillance and loss of privacy and loss of liberty. I've yet to find one that gives me much more than a shrug. They don't care. That's chilling in itself. I mean, one reason is wait till they turn 60 and all their medical records start getting spread all over the internet. Then they might be a little bit more concerned about that. But I'm amazed how willing young people are to just let the world pry into every private moment of their life.
Well, that's an interesting point. That means, as a male, I've done a lot of dumb stuff in public. I'm sure at some point in time, I stumbled out of a strip club in Las Vegas drunk.
Mm-hmm. And it took a piss against a public building.
And I probably wouldn't want that video online, but you think that 20-year-olds don't care?
Not yet. I keep asking this of my students, my neighbors. I'm a Boy Scout leader. I ask them, and it's an absurd question to them. This is the milieu they grew up in. They don't know much different.
They don't even ponder the possibilities. Or is it they ponder the possibility of the strip club example that I put out and they kind of say, well, I don't care. I like this transparency, or they don't really ponder it?
I think you'll get both answers. One of them is I don't think they really understand the implications of an entire life and all of the screw ups you do and illegal activity and all of that, all sitting there on a gigantic database. I think they just don't see a problem. Meanwhile, well, we can get into this, but I put it in the book about Mike Steep, the guy at Stanford who runs the Digital Cities Project, where he went out and bought 3 consumer products. I think he bought a stick of gum, maybe a tank of gas, and a newspaper or something. He had the software where he could track what happened to the information on those sales. Within 6 weeks, I think, that data had gone out to 1,500 databases around the world. By the end of the year, it was in the tens of thousands. Literally every major computer network in the world knew he bought that stick of chewing gum. I find that beyond chilling. I mean, that literally is the end of liberty.
Well, that's a great word to jump off from. I mean, I don't know all the ways I can protect from what's about to happen or what is happening, but I guess the V for Vendetta mask and burner phones are the place to start. So it's kind of like the first thing they're going to do when people start wearing masks, what are they going to do? They're going to make masks illegal, right? That's the first thing.
Well, that's what Britain did. You can't wear the hoodie. You can't hide your face. It's more pernicious than we imagine.
Let's jump into the big inflection because, okay, for me, I go back to, I played around with my Mac computers, late 80s, early 90s. But for me, it was those AOL disks arriving in 1994. The kickoff was really Netscape going public summer of 95. I put a website up in 1996. I mean, it was so obvious to me this was life-changing. It didn't make a difference what age you were. This was going to be the point in time where it all started.
I was CompuServe, obviously the AOL disks. Then in the early 90s, I set up a newspaper syndicate of my own using a 300 baud modem. And I would write newspaper stories for the Boston Globe, Dallas Morning News, and sometimes the LA Times and the New York Times. With my 300 baud, it would take me half an hour to send a story out. But I thought it was a miracle. I even go back so far that when I was 14 years old, I went to SRI, sat down and played on DARPANET. I actually got to try the internet before it was the internet, and it was the most excruciatingly boring experience, typing in, 60 characters and numbers just so I could say hello to somebody at Caltech. I had no idea what was coming, and I was there at ground zero.
That's an interesting way you say it. You had no idea what was coming. I would have to say that even in the late 90s, as a real big user of everything and making money online, I didn't see that they were going to shrink my desktop Mac to a phone so quickly. I didn't see that coming. Amazon, none of that stuff was really surprising to me, the constant commerce and all that stuff. But the shrinking down, and I think now also, I guess it was easy to see for many years where we were going with the lack of privacy. I haven't really thought about what it means. And you really have thought about that. And you really consider where we're at right now today a major inflection point. Why don't you define that inflection point from your perspective?
Well, the metaphor we use is phase change, which is a term from physics. It deals with when you have a particular material, molecules, you change their temperature, for example, or put them under pressure. They go through a fundamental change. So if you lived in a temperate climate, tropical climate, and all you saw was liquid water, you would think you knew water. You would think, well, you can run it through pipes and you use hydraulics and you measure flow and all those kinds of things. You know what water is. But if suddenly the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time in your life and the water turned into ice, you would have no idea what had happened. You wouldn't recognize ice as water. Once you did figure out it was water, you wouldn't know how it behaves. You couldn't put it through the pipes anymore. You wouldn't know that ice is actually bigger than water. Most other things, when they turn solid, they get smaller, but not water. And that's why life exists on Earth. There's all these other things. And if you take it above boiling, it turns to steam, which has all sorts of other properties. And now, for one thing, you're using hydraulics and hydrodynamics. For ice, you're using solid state physics. The rules have changed too. What we're saying is there have been certain moments in human history that everything has come together. There's been so many changes that suddenly the whole thing goes through a phase change. It fundamentally turns into something different. We really only had two so far, the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. Note what I'm leaving out. I'm leaving out Periclean Greece, and I'm leaving out the Roman Empire and the Renaissance and all of those things because they weren't full phase changes. Full phase changes change everything. Imagine if you were a hunter-gatherer and you were in the Levant driving your sheep or your goats. Suddenly, this is 4000 BC, suddenly you come across the city of Jericho. Would you have any idea what you were looking at? With buildings and carts drawn by oxen and food production and all of these things and hierarchies, government, schools, you would have no idea what you were looking at. It'd be so alien. that you would have to check to make sure you were looking at a human activity. Then you would have no idea how to behave in this world. I mean, there's a famous story of Genghis Khan with his hordes when he crossed the Great Wall of China and marched on Beijing. When they hit the town, they went right down the main street, and it was full of shops full of gold and beautiful carvings and everything else. They went right by him. All the wealth of China was sitting in front of them. These guys could take it, and they didn't want it. They had no idea what it was good for. They went and attacked the women and stole the food and weapons because that was their world. Well, that's a phase change. You not only can't predict what it's going to look like until it's on you, you can't guess the rules before you encounter it. So that was the first one.
The issue becomes how quickly can you adjust to that phase change?
Yeah. You have that image from the Bible of the Israelites where, having gone through the Sinai for 40 years, they're not allowed to cross the Jordan. It's kind of allegorical. Only the young people can, because in a sense, they're not sullied by the past. They can cope. You see people in the Amazon rainforest when they come into these cities. They're lost. Oftentimes they're lost for their entire lives. Their children adapt to this new world. It's an interesting question. One of these is happening right now. Will all of us be left behind? Maybe we can't fully participate in this new world. Anyway, the second of these phase changes is the Industrial Revolution. I know at Davos, Schwab has this big thing about how we're going into the fourth Industrial Revolution. Well, water-driven factories was the first one. The second one is replaceable parts like Eli Whitney with the rifles and stuff. And the third one is modern factory system with Ford and all that. And the latest one is the digital revolution. These are all considered part of the Industrial Revolution. I don't have a problem with that. But the idea that we're going into an evolutionary next step now, I think is completely wrong. Bill Davidow, my co-author, he's a veteran venture capitalist. He was the VP of marketing at Intel. He's a real pioneer of the Valley. It was really his idea that this is something fundamentally different. This is a phase change, and we call it the autonomous revolution. Because this, for the first time in human history, we're handing off more and more of the decision making and the thought processes and the information gathering to our machines. The implications of that are essentially beyond our imagination right now. The best we can do is sense that something huge is going on beneath the surface and is starting to bubble up. This growing fear of AI, when you hear Bill Gates and these other powerful people and scientists like Stephen Hawking saying, beware of AI, beware of robotics, you kind of think, well, what is this all about? They've been watching too many science fiction movies. But I think there's this growing unease that something fundamental is changing. We have no idea, like past phase changes, what the new rules are. We're going to have to grope our way forward and experience a lot of dislocations. Remember, the past two phase changes produced oceans of blood. Yet, at the same time, ultimately, they created enormous improvements in human existence. I mean, you can look at the life expectancy charts. They make one bump when agriculture arrives, and they make a big bump when the Industrial Revolution arrives, from living to be 28 years old to now living to be 80 years old. The possibility is enormous for improvements in human existence, but getting there, getting through the actual revolution itself can be pretty damn awful.
Here's a place to start with what you're describing. My first thought starts to become the average smart person is not needed in this revolution. They're not needed.
You're exactly right.
What do they need you for? Because it's being done somewhere else. You might be a smart guy or smart lady with skills and whatnot, but you're not needed. And if you're not needed, the secondary follow-up there, if you're not needed, how do you profit? And if you don't profit, how do you live?
That's exactly right. I remember 20, 30 years ago when they talked about robotics and automation, all of us college-educated types thought, oh, well, that's not going to hit us. There's going to be robots replacing that guy on the assembly line, bolting on Ford F-150 quarter panels. It's going to affect the guy digging my sprinkler system. It's not going to affect me because I'm a thinking guy. I have a brain job. Well, the fact of the matter is, many of those guys putting in those sprinkler systems may have jobs longer than the rest of us. Human intelligence, human IQ has gone up about a point every century. Our machines now, the IQ is going up about a point a year or every 2 years. They are going to run right past us. And an awful lot of the things that we thought were safe areas, being a doctor. Well, I just talked to my next door neighbor the other day. He was talking about how more and more of his jobs being replaced. You heard that announcement by Google a couple of weeks ago that their AI system for radiology actually gave more accurate results than trained radiologists. My dentist talks about being replaced. They're experimenting with robots doing work on teeth. I thought I was safe because I'm a writer, but now it turns out they're using AI to create novels and they don't tell anybody. I do know that I'm a fourth generation newspaper man. Nowadays, when you open the newspaper, about half of that paper is probably written by machines. All the standard stuff that used to be drudge work for me, like sales and earnings and box scores of games and promotions and all that, that's all being done by machine. Machines are slowly capturing more and more of the employment world and leaving people behind. Bill and I wrote a piece for the Harvard Business Review where we discussed ZEVs. ZEVs are zero economic citizens, basically. Zero economic value citizenry is essentially people who, no matter how well they are trained, how well they are educated, how smart they are, they're not employable. And they will never be, again, employable.
As you say that, let me share something with you. I have a lot of guests on this show, a lot of people that you probably know, a lot of smart people, a lot of great Harvard professors.
Yeah, Nobel Prize winners.
But here's the thing. Everyone keeps talking about the damn job. Every book seems to be about the job, the job, the job. Look, I was in my late 20s when Netscape went public, mid to late 20s. I knew at that moment in time, at least instinctively, I felt I have to be an entrepreneur. It doesn't mean I know how I'm going to make my money. It doesn't mean I know what will happen next year. It means there's probably going to be additional change that I can't predict. But I said to myself, I can't go this path that everyone tells me to go, where you try to find the gold watch security. It just doesn't seem real to me. And I felt that when Netscape went public. It was just kind of this entrepreneurial mindset. Today, when I look at your work, it's like, I don't know any other way that you can even attempt to get around what you were putting out there, unless someone starts each day saying, I got to hustle. I got to sell something and I got to hustle and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But the notion that we're going to have a fixed lifetime direction that is very predictable is so clearly dead. And your work just reinforces it.
For generations, we grew up with the idea of the good job, the one you stayed at for a long time and that you retired from and you had a pension and all that. We modified it slightly with, well, here in Silicon Valley, you might have 12 jobs, but you're getting stock options and you'll be permanently employed and all of that. But the fact of the matter is, that's going away. That's one of those rules of the Industrial Revolution that is, it may not survive the phase change. We're already seeing, we talk about, oh, well, unemployment is down and all of that. But remember, we had this huge body of people that had opted out of the economy. In a sense, those are the early ZEVs. The world has no use for them. What they do can be much better done by a machine, and they're not going to find any other place to work. The interesting thing is, look what's going on in California right now with AB5. I don't know if you know about that.
The gig law.
Right. Now, given what you're saying about how to survive in this new world, you got to hustle every day. You got to be entrepreneurial. You got to run yourself as a business and all of that. It would seem that the most dominant employment phenomena of the century to come is going to be the rationalization and systematization and monetization of gig work. What do we have in California? We have this rearguard action to make gig work illegal.
To preserve the old order.
Yes, indeed. And it's using the old obsolete rules to deal with a fundamentally new problem, and that never works out. Vox has laid off hundreds of gig workers in California. I know people that are contemplating moving just into Arizona or just into Nevada or just into Oregon so they can work for California companies but not get laid off because they're gig workers. This is absurd. But who wants this? Well, the unions want it. The state government of California wants it, but is it good for the people of California? I don't think so. When you consider perhaps 40 or 60% of people are going to be unemployable in another 30 or 40 years, don't you want them to be able to find some sort of value in their life, to get some kind of work and get paid for it? And yet we're working absolutely against it, just as nationally, entrepreneurs. It's harder and harder right now to do a startup. The VCs are just going for the good deals, the really good deals. No one's doing startup money anymore, seed money. I can remember going out talking to VCs and getting seed money pretty easy. I mean, I was there at the beginning of eBay and watched Pierre and Jeff do that. That isn't true anymore. The government does everything they can to keep entrepreneurs from starting companies. I mean, if anything's going to get us through this, it's going to be new companies. It's going to be entrepreneurial startups. They create all the new jobs and all the new wealth. Yet they have no constituency. They have no representation. They're not sending lobbyists back to DC like Google is or Facebook. They struggle along. We're making it harder and harder for them to succeed. It just seems like we're doing everything backwards right now in the face of this fundamental phase shift that's going to be taking place in our lives.
Let me shift you to a topic outside of where we've gone so far, talking about employment, jobs, the individual. I want to talk about something physical for a moment that people have depended on for a long, long time, and that's real estate. Again, I don't feel like I'm some clairvoyant here, but I feel like I've been observing real estate for many decades, wondering what's going on, because this tech is going to mess real estate up. And I remember thinking in 1995, 1996, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is so great. I was living in Northern Virginia, kind of a mini Silicon Valley at the time. I remember thinking all these office buildings near Dulles Airport, they're not going to be used. They're going to go by the way of the dinosaur. And of course, we doubled down and built even more in the next 2-3 decades. I look at real estate and I think, gosh, are people really pondering this? It's just owning a home, the American dream. It will go up in value over the course of your lifetime. You either sell it, give it away to your kids. This whole notion's going by the way of the dinosaur. All you really need is what's it cost to, I mean, look, if you're lucky enough to be one of the first people and you would have bought real estate in 1975 in America, hey, you've done pretty well. All you have to do is look at what Amazon's done to the mall system. I mean, it's going to happen everywhere.
I'll tell you two stories. One of them is the lady who lives across the street from me bought her house, a suburban house in Sunnyvale, for, I think, $13,000. Well, we are right equidistant from Google, Apple, Intel, Tesla. Her house is now worth $2.7 million. That incredible increase has camouflaged what else is going on, what you're talking about. That when everything goes virtual and when everything goes autonomous, a lot of these existing structures don't matter anymore. You don't need the big office building. You can virtualize it and scatter people around. But even more, you can turn the lights off if it's all machines. The people that right now are paying their mortgage based upon a steady job, if those jobs go away, what is the future? Do we suddenly suffer a huge loss of disposable income? I mean, is our future the one-bedroom apartment with a wall-sized TV screen that if we're willing to watch commercials, we can fly a drone over the Grand Canyon? We can do all these things on our wall-sized TV, but we won't have any money to go out and actually do those things. Food will be delivered to us, all that other stuff. Perhaps the government's giving us a fixed income. You've heard all the talk about that. At least we have something disposable. I mean, are we willing to trade what we have now for that world but it's a lot easier. Machines are taking care of a lot of the problems. We're healthier and we live longer. I mean, that might be the trade-off.
It's not really a choice, is it? I mean, we're going there.
Yeah, it sounds pretty awful to me, but at the same time, I was a newspaper man. I mean, I wrote things that were put in print and thrown in people's front yards. I don't think either of my sons in their 20s, one of them's a journalist, has read a paper in their adult life. I mean, there is a fundamental change and we see the world differently. I worry, we talked about this before, I worry about losing my privacy, losing my liberty. But you talk to a 20-year-old, I'm a college professor, I talk to my students, they don't seem to care. They're fine with their entire lives being displayed out there for the world. They don't mind walking by 500 cameras a day, being surveilled. They don't mind every transaction they make and every instant message they send being tracked and stored out there. In a sense, that world is already arriving and young people are already adapting to the new rules and they kind of understand them. Most of us find them abhorrent.
But the biggest thing is those young people, though, they don't have, for example, the opportunity to buy that house for $13,000 that within 3 decades might be $3 million. They don't have that opportunity. I guess the hard thing for you and I is you and I see that once existed. Since they never experienced it, they don't have any friends and associates. They have no frame of reference. They really don't pine for, oh, I wish I could have bought the house for $13,000. They just accept, even perhaps without really knowing, they just accept that they are at a lower quality or a lower earning potential than prior generations.
Yeah, you read about the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in England and living inside of these rotting Roman palaces. They thought that giants had built them because they were so much more beautiful and well constructed. I mean, they were living in these places where the roof had fallen in because they didn't know how to fix a roof. I mean, from generation to generation, a lot of memory is lost. One of the things we write about in the book is during phase change, we change. We change as human beings. Our notion of time and space and ourselves and our interaction with other people, even our sense of the universe and God, all of those things change during phase changes. Once you've gone through to the other side, it's hard to imagine how people lived and thought before. We have very little record of the transition at the birth of the dawn of the agricultural revolution. I mean, I think we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very strange, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is the most bizarre thing you'll ever read. It doesn't give us a glimpse into the minds of what people were like then. We have some examples of descriptions at the change of the Industrial Revolution, like Dickens, but we can't put our heads into the minds of those people that lived in the 1730s, right at the point of transition. My sense is we think that we're out there in the cutting edge. We're the most modern people in history. We study Moore's law and we predict the future and all that. But I suspect, unlike us, we kind of know what our grandparents were like and how they thought and how they saw the world. I'm not so sure our grandchildren will have any idea of the world that we live in right now. Any.
It causes pause. I don't think the average person really is sitting around and contemplating this. It's kind of like the lobster in the cold water, and then you turn the heat up. So we're in the cold water, the heat spring turned up, and we're just getting acclimated to it. It's not hitting us as a major fright point, like jump now. It's not hitting us like that.
Yeah, well, the fundamental difference is if you were born in 4000 BC, it took several hundred years for this change to happen. If you were born in 1745, it took about 30 or 40 years to happen. This time around, it'll probably happen within our lifetimes. We may be the first people to truly experience an entire phase change. Already now, think about it. When you were a kid and you went into the kitchen, what did you see? When you turned on the TV, what did you see? Somewhere along the line, you have a wall-sized TV, flat screen, that's got all these streaming services. You have access to all the information in the world. In the kitchen, your refrigerator talks to you. You can turn on the oven from the other side of the world. Radical changes have occurred in our lifetimes. And yet somehow we don't seem to notice that it's happened until after it's happened.
get to an example that I brought up earlier, and I want you to give me another example that will wake my mind up to see where the potential can go about how the negative aspects can unfold. I brought up the idea that someone's walking down the street. Let's say a bad actor sees an older couple, and that older couple, let's say they're in their 70s or 80s, clearly they've done well, and a younger bad actor snapshots the old guy's picture, immediately knows who he is, where he lives. Next thing you know, the bad actor's at that old couple's house later in the night doing something untoward. That shift, for me, I'm looking for other examples that cause me to kind of just throw it on top of the fire. There's my fire. I'm throwing on the fire, the loss of privacy. Everyone knows who everyone is, what they do, et cetera, which is not such a cool concept to me, but maybe other people like it. What other kind of ways that we walk into the phase change like that you can put on the table that will really cause people to go, oh shit, I didn't know that was coming?
Well, first of all, let's take your example and turn it on its head, which is, let's say I'm 17 years old and I steal a car. Now, the world is full of 17-year-old guys that joyride in a car or steal something out of a store. Well, now all of a sudden, my dad was in law enforcement. He was actually a spy, but he was also in law enforcement. He always said people change. Certain percentage of people don't change, and they stay criminals all their life, and they show that inclination at a very young age, and they have a life of crime. But 95% of the people, that guys who steal that car when they're 17, live good, honorable, normal lives as citizens. They don't commit other crimes. They grew out of it. Well, in the past, your records got expunged when you were 21. You went on with your life. Now, no record ever gets expunged. Every single act you commit is there forever, is inescapable. We think, well, maybe that's good for criminal behavior. Maybe, but we're going to lose an awful lot of people who changed and turned their lives around, but are punished for the rest of their lives. But let's go smaller than that. Let's say you're a couple months late on your mortgage payment. Now, in the past, that would hurt your credit rating for a little while. It might hurt your relationship with that bank. But over time, you got back on a good payment schedule. Or you're in college and you write a rubber check knowing that, it takes 3 days to process, I'll cover it. Then you don't cover it and it bounces. Now, the world we're entering into, there's the thing called an algorithmic prison. You are punished for that behavior. Oftentimes, you don't even know about it. For example, let's say you want to refi the house 20 years later. Well, you're given certain refinancing packages to choose from. What you don't know is that person next to you, who's also filing for a refinance, didn't miss 2 mortgage checks 20 years ago. That person is being given 20 different products to choose from. Your world is being constricted around you by computers, and you don't know it. Your actual reality is now being distorted by what machines have chosen you're allowed to see and do and participate in and to learn. We're really seeing in China right now, they're pushing that where you get 5 jaywalking tickets and suddenly you can't go to that Taylor Swift concert or go to Disneyland or the equivalent of that. More and more, we are going to be circumscribed by these algorithmic prisons that we don't even know are there.
Here's a great example. If I flip on something like the particular, I think there's a Fox Sports talk radio show thing that I occasionally turn into with Skip Bayless. If I access it with VPN and whatnot, it's fine. I can pull it up. But if I don't, it doesn't even appear on the app. It's nowhere to be seen. You can see that people are already constructing these borders where you don't know things exist. Clearly, across YouTube, this is, depending on what country you want to access YouTube from, you see completely different content. You don't even know about the content you're not seeing.
We didn't see this coming. The part that drives me crazy is, for myself, I've written about Moore's Law more than anybody on earth. I know Gordon. I've written books about it. Every time I extrapolate out forward from Moore's Law into what the future looks like, I don't see these problems. One reason I think is psychologically, I don't want to see the worst of these future scenarios. I don't want to see the surveillance state. I don't want to see a government that strips away our liberty. I want to think about, gee, faster computers and smarter phones and all that kind of thing. But it's out there and we should see it coming and we should expect the worst. I mean, this idea of a algorithmic prison becomes one that we thought the internet was going to give us this panoply of experiences, accesses to every fount of wisdom on earth, this cornucopia of products and services and all that. It has, but at the same time, it's restricting all of those things and increasingly doing it. We see less and less of reality, and we see the reality that's being presented for us.
When I look at your example about the refi and the mortgages, my first thought that comes into my mind, this might be different than other folks. Other folks might be thinking, oh my gosh, that's so bad. I don't know about it. My first thought is, I don't want your mortgage. I don't want to ever be associated with having to get a refi because I can see which way this system is going if I don't want the drama in my life. So I don't want to have that. All the different pain points where you can potentially have control, someone else can have control over you, you want to eliminate. Now, somebody might be saying, well, Mike, you still have to spend money. I want to hear from you. I'm not saying the crypto folks have figured this out yet, but it seems like if there's enough people that assemble on the side of using a particular type of new monetary currency or new payment system, if enough people exist there, businesses will cater to them. So it seems like the place where you can potentially have freedom, some freedom going forward, is if you can control your purse. If you can't control your purse, I mean, it's the Matrix, it's Escape from New York, it's all kinds of crazy stuff in the future.
Well, here's the thing. We write about this too, is that we've now, for 1,000,000 years, 200,000 years more precisely, when you talk about modern man, we have lived in one world, one universe. It's the natural universe. The natural universe does not have a purpose. Maybe in the mind of God, there's a purpose to the universe, but it's unknowable to us. When you go outside, that tree out there does not exist for you. When you have children, there's no plan there in a sense. Babies aren't born with a specific purpose. Now we've added a second universe that we inhabit. For the first time in human history, we inhabit two universes, the natural universe and the virtual universe. They are fundamentally different. We have evolved to be able to operate successfully in the natural world. The virtual world is a created world with a purpose. The purpose is to monetize you. It's going to sell you stuff. It's going to learn all about your behavior. It's going to enlist you to create content for it. In the most pernicious case, it's going to give you things for free in exchange for surrendering yourself, your privacy. We're not built for that world there. We may evolve into it, but right now we are creatures of the natural world, increasingly spending our time in this virtual world. And when I talk about the rules changing, this is a perfect example. I mean, in the natural world, you play Army when you're a kid. It's a very specific activity and it's simple and it's fun and you're using the imagination. When you play a massive multiplayer online war game, that's a very different thing. Not only is it more complex, but it's structured for you. It adapts to you. It creates a new reality continuously for you. It learns about you as you go. Every study has found that it begins to rewire your brain in specific ways. Everything else in this virtual world changes your mind, your brain in different ways, restructures it.
As you go down that path, though, what is also unfolding that we're not thinking about is that if we go down this direction, we're not going to live as long. I mean, from a physical standpoint, if we are sitting, playing multiplayer games, drinking Cokes, and becoming overweight, there's another aspect of our existence and our evolution, we're not going to evolve to longer lifespans at our current rate of using tech, because the tech is turning us in.
Take a look at America. I mean, this is the first time we've seen adult white males experiencing a declining life expectancy.
There's a reason for that.
The other possibility is Ray Kurzweil's solution, the singularity. We just poured our brains onto the computers themselves, which is chilling in its own way.
See, I love that idea. There's another author out there, Robin Hanson, who economist at George Mason, who has written about this. And I love the notion that if somebody can take my mind, scan it to a hard drive, and I can have that consciousness on a drive and kind of port from Mike's physical body to the drive, I'm okay with that.
Well, I'm always haunted by Barney Clark. You remember him? He's the guy that got the first artificial heart. They stuck that thing in his chest. All he heard was clicking. Day and night, 24 hours a day, every second.
God, you just ruined my fantasy.
He begged the doctors to kill him.
Oh, my God.
I wonder if the first brain that goes into a computer like that, they're going to turn it on and it's going to start screaming. We have no idea.
You'll be alive, you'll have consciousness, but something will be messed up.
Yes. Yes. It's like every time they create these chimeras by breeding different things together and cloning them and all that, they get these weird flaws in them.
They pop out of the mom and they kind of make a weird sound and die.
Yeah. Just strange things, weird diseases and autoimmune things and all that. I worry that's what lies in the future there. My short-term worry is with these two worlds, when we increasingly inhabit the virtual world, and as things like jobs start disappearing, it's all going to be the bread and circuses of the virtual world. We're going to spend all of our days sitting in front of that wall-sized screen, interactive 3D television screen, because there won't be work to go to, there won't be school beyond this, that there's a phenomena of phase changes we call substitutional equivalences, where you replace one thing with something new and fun and exciting and sexy. It seems like you're just doing a substitution of one thing for something just like it. But in reality, they're very different. It's like that black Raymond Loewy designed Bell telephone in your living room that one day becomes that smartphone in your hand. It's still a phone. It serves that same function, but it is utterly different. And your relationship with it is completely different. It changes society in fundamental ways that you can't predict is happening. This substitutional equivalence is going on in everything. Everything we virtualize, we move from the natural world to the virtual world. It's a substitutional equivalence, but the equivalence is, well, it's not truly equivalent. It just appears that way. It's really, really different.
I want to take you back to some of our early conversation about particular pair of individuals. But before I go there, in your book, I want to go to a really big picture thought that we kind of hinted at, which is what we're facing here in the future is not necessarily a production problem. People are plenty productive today. They're not necessarily profiting more, but they're plenty productive. But the real issue is a distribution problem. And I think, and I don't take anything away from him, I guess I could say, well, gosh, that'd be pretty fun to have done that. I don't want anybody to go to Jeff Bezos and drain his bank account. I just salute the success. But man, if you got 50% of America with less than $1,000 in the bank. You have the Walmart family owning more than like half of their wealth. You got Jeff, who's got $150 billion. And I'm a liberty guy. I'm not somebody that wants the government to be in charge of distribution and making everybody, quote, equal. But damn it, there's a distribution problem here if people got no money and no opportunity and no hope, and one guy's got everything.
No, I understand. I understand the paradox of all that. On the one hand, you don't want to say, okay, you've made enough. We're going to take anything you make after that, because those people will never be innovative again. And those are unbelievably innovative people. They've already proven that. On the other hand, the gap between the rich and the poor is as great as ever, maybe greater than it's ever before. Some people are simply being left behind, and more are going to be left behind. If we're down to an aristocracy that's 10% of the population and the 90% are sitting in those studio apartments staring at the wall-sized TV, what do we have? One of the interesting phenomena right now is, and no one has really written this down, is that the virtual world is deflationary and the natural world now is inflationary. That's why it's hard to be middle class now, because more and more people have access to the internet, they have TVs, they have smartphones, they have all of those cool things. And yet the price of groceries just keeps climbing and climbing. The price of houses keeps going up. Living in this world is going to get harder and harder. At the same time, the virtual world is going to try to substitute by giving us bread and circuses, online colleges, and TV shows and participatory activities, and virtually flying that drone over the Grand Canyon. Where does that balance point lie where you actually have a reasonable and acceptable life in this world and also get the benefits of that virtual world? And I think right now, there's a lot. I mean, you look at the studies of people that are at poverty level, and they've all got TVs. Most of them have a computer. It might be a little bit old. They got a cell phone. People go, well, look at that. They're rich. They've got all those things. But they really don't. They are poor because their buying power for the other necessities of life is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I think the situation we're in is going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. The only mitigating factors are, like I said, entrepreneurship. And the other one that Bill always talks about is one area that seems to do well during periods of great change like this is building and trades, because everybody needs a different kind of house. The cities have to be rebuilt in a different way. Like you said, the office buildings become obsolete. But people might want to, as they get poorer, they actually might want to move to the cities because they can benefit from all the infrastructure there. Building roads, those kinds of things actually might be a good part of the economy for a while, but only for a brief period of time. My sense is that the gap between the very rich and the poor is going to get greater and greater. There's going to be a greater percentage of people who are not as economically well off. They may not be in destitution because we're going to have all these services. The drone brings your food to your house from the supermarket and all that. Certain parts of life are going to get a whole lot better. But I think certain other parts of life are going to diminish deeply. Perhaps part of the answer is people won't remember how good it was.
Here's a way that I have seen in the last 6 or 7 years that I think is interesting. I don't know if it will port over. I don't know if it will continue what I'm about to tell you. But what's really interesting in a place like Vietnam, where post the war, the other countries kind of built virtual walls around the country. So they have visa issues. You got a very bright country, very merchant class. When you build all these walls up and kind of the economy stumbles along for basically until the 90s, something interesting happened when it came to fast food. There's no penetration by McDonald's. So the people are very, very comfortable with, oh, the guy on the corner makes great banh mi. I know the cost. I know what the cost should be. So when McDonald's finally rolls around in the 2012-13 time period, finally rolls around, there's no immediate acceptance because their tastes have come to something else. McDonald's can't beat them on price. And I think also there's another important part that I think I've seen with this little example is there's a sharing mindset. They kind of seem to understand that if they give all of their money to the big unknown group, then it can affect everyone locally on the corner, and the guy on the corner who's making a living won't be there. Whereas what we've done in America, we all have the cowboy mindset. We say, oh, okay, you know what? This convenience came along. Screw Tyson's Corner Mall in Virginia, 3 miles from where I grew up. That place is over the hill. I got Jeff and Amazon. And everybody just shifted overnight. The whole country shifts overnight to something. Not surprising, one guy's worth all this money. But we've not thought about that our lack of cooperation is bringing us down. The lack of cooperation is absolutely bringing us down. That could be one of the only saving graces, is if people start to think, you know what, if my neighbor is going down the toilet and all my other neighbors are going down the toilet, but I'm rich, I'm not really rich, I'm going to have trouble. I think that's something that we've lost in this whole thing, is that the sharing mindset could be a way out too. I just don't know if that's the way that typical current modern humanity wants to go, because it requires a lot of thinking. And culturally, that's not really the American way.
Remember when the internet first appeared, we thought, oh, this could be the most democratizing communal phenomena we've ever seen. And in fact, it's reducing us into tribes. The other thing is it's homogenizing things. I mean, it's wonderful. Vietnam managed to do this partly because it was isolated. It was enforced isolation. Once you enter out into that global economy, I mean, you can drive across America now. Every town that used to have the little diner and all that, they're all the same. They all have fast food places and all that. And I can understand, well, you're providing massive amounts of calories at a low cost to 300 million people. Yet something profound's been lost. And every time that diner disappears, within a generation, nobody remembers what it was. Nobody remembers what it was like. When you talk about Tyson's Corners, I can remember when Tyson's Corners was a roadhouse and a gas station. Now it's got, 200,000 people, a Rodeo Drive quality stores and all that. I mean, so the trade-off is, yeah, I miss that roadhouse. I miss that wide spot in the road driving down from DC. But somebody now could say, yeah, but look what we have here. I can go to Gucci. I can go get world-class steaks. I can do all of this kind of stuff at Tyson's Corners.
Two families essentially ended up controlling all of that land. One owns the Washington Nationals. The other is a group named West Group. But two families essentially just happened to buy all that land up, 50s and 60s, and boom, now roll forward, they're generations ahead. That's something we've not really hinted at today too, is it becomes a math problem. I mean, how is Jeff Bezos and his wealth, how is that, unless he makes tremendously negative mistakes, which is harder and harder to do now, given that we've seen all the mistakes of the last 30 or 40 years, it's hard to imagine that Jeff Bezos is not controlling, if America continues to exist, if the world continues to exist, that he's not controlling significant parts of populations and wealth going forward 1,000 years.
Yeah, well, there's several factors here. One of them is we saw this new technology. We saw how ubiquitous it was coming, how quickly it could scale up and benefit people and all that. We gave special governmental breaks to these big corporations that never would have been given to the robber barons of 100 years ago. The second thing is most of these outfits took advantage of the nature of the web. Take Facebook, essentially, or Twitter, essentially freeware. This is what we talked about. Freeware is a con game because it's not free. You're doing a barter system of your life for the experiences you're getting. Using that model and some stealth techniques like Google slowly moved advertising in the media into its own operation. When you put search on your Vanity Fair magazine site, all the searches and revenues went to Google. They backdoored their way in. Finally, this collapse of entrepreneurship. Historically, here in Silicon Valley, I've seen charts. You look at the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and 90s, the 2010s, and look at the 10 biggest companies in town. Inevitably, they all changed every decade. There might be one that managed to go a couple of them, like HP or Intel. But for the most part, the dominant companies of every generation in Silicon Valley was different. The dominant firms of one era faded away. And that was because entrepreneurship, new little startup companies appeared, came up with better solutions, better service, better products, new technology. They ran those companies out of the market and took over.
The Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world just buy them.
Yes, because I've seen so many business plans over the last 20 years where the last sentence is not, then we go public. The last sentence is, then we sell to Google. or then we sell to Facebook. Instagram and WhatsApp should have put Facebook in the grave. They should have created a new company and created a new source of wealth, distributed that wealth to a whole new set of shareholders and founders and employees and all that. Instead, what happened? Facebook bought them up. Facebook, as it was beginning to fade, it jumped to Instagram. The Instagram folks, people who use Instagram are getting in their 30s. They're jumping to WhatsApp or some other place. Zuckerberg, he's not running into any problem with antitrust. When IBM tried to do this in the 50s and early 60s, they got hammered by the government. When Microsoft and Intel did it in the 90s, they got hammered. But right now, the Facebooks of the world, the Googles, the Amazons, nothing's stopping them. They can buy up everything.
DC is bought and paid for.
Yes. On top of that, Congress, you saw the hearings with Zuckerberg. They're idiots. They have no idea. These technology guys can go in there and do the flashy fan dance, dazzle these guys with technology, these congressmen and senators. They don't ask the right questions. Every techno-savvy person I know is watching some of those hearings going, they didn't ask any of the important stuff. If you don't ask the right questions, then you don't get useful answers. You don't find out the truth. So these big companies are getting bigger and bigger. They've learned to just snatch up these startups before they become a threat. And as a result, we're not seeing like the 90s, where you have the dot-com boom, where you have 4,000 companies get created. Yeah, 90% of them died, but there were still several hundred exciting companies left over. They grew into great companies and made their employees wealthy, and the next crowd came along.
Why does Zuckerberg not talk to you?
I've never had the opportunity, and everybody I know who's ever dealt with him, I don't want to make a medical diagnosis, but everybody I know uses the same word, spectrum. He's a very unusual guy. In fact, a lot of the guys running Silicon Valley now are not the old guard. I mean, not like the old guard. I mean, I go all the way back to the early days of Silicon Valley. I grew up here. I saw it being built, and I knew all the founders. I knew all the chip guys. They had all grown up. Their dad, well, Gordon Moore's dad was a sheriff in Half Moon Bay. Bob Noyce's dad was a preacher in Iowa. Jerry Sanders' dad he didn't even know his dad. These guys are guys who built companies like National and Intel and AMD and all that. They all had blue collar backgrounds. They had grown up mostly in middle America. They had all the old verities and belief systems, and they were normal guys. They may have partied a lot. They enjoyed getting wealthy and had fun and bought their fast cars and all that. But they still subscribed to the old rules, the old way of doing things, of courtesy and fairness and all that. David Packard did all of his deals with a handshake, even when they were a multi-billion-dollar company. Nowadays, the men and women who run this town now are products of a very different reality. They don't come from hard scrabble lives. They come from nice neighborhoods. They didn't go to the community college because they didn't have enough money. They had to save and work to get tuition to go to a good school. These kids got scholarships. They've been cosseted and petted their whole lives. They got their jobs right away. They got rich young. They have really no conception of how the average person lives. They don't understand why somebody might object to having their most private and intimate details monetized and sold to other corporations. We're kind of trapped in the thrall of these very odd people. It's worrisome. We're setting up a system where they're not going to be replaced. They're not going to take their $1 billion and go home and sponsor scholarships or try to cure disease or something else. They're going to accumulate wealth. There's no new, fresh blood to replace them with new startups, with scrappy startups that change the world.
They're building moats that you can't get around.
That's right. That's right. And they'll do their best to, if anybody shows up that looks like it has the potential to be a competitor, they'll snap it up. The founders of those companies will be happier than hell because they're getting $20 million a piece for 3 years' work. But all those thousands of employees that they could have had who would have been vastly rewarded by the IPO. Never happened.
Hey, by the way, in our time that we have rolling down, I want to take you back to the beginning before we sign out. I want to take you back to a pair of individuals that we brought up, Wozniak and Jobs. I have no desire for, it seems like anytime I turn on a documentary or something, it's like just drama, 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 drama. Okay, that's fine. I guess that people love that. Now, me, as a guy who's been using a Mac since 88, 89, I don't care about that stuff. I have enjoyed watching an individual, I guess Jobs, who really was pushing for this beauty, was pushing for this user interface, regardless of all the warts that you probably know about. It doesn't interest me as much because I'm kind of like the end user.
Hell, I've been interviewed for most of those documentaries. Yeah.
It doesn't interest me. The warts don't interest me as much, but I'm curious, as a close observer, how did he develop, or how did he come to have this sensibility, especially with the development of, let's say, the first iMac and then moving into the first iPhone? This was a very unique artistic sensibility, seemingly instinctive on his part. I had a programmer on this show who worked on one, I think it was one of the keyboards on the iPhones, was just talking about taking products in to show him later on before he passed and how the process went down and how hands-on he was in making decisions. And I just thought that was so interesting. It wasn't that I didn't read it that he had, maybe he did, but I didn't read it that he had such a kind of a quote God complex, but I read that this guy just had such great sensibilities. How did that unfold?
Well, there's two Steve Jobs. There's Steve Jobs' first incarnation at Apple Computer, and then there's Steve Jobs when he returned and he was dying. They have certain commonalities, but in other ways, they are radically different human beings. The Steve Jobs of early Apple was, it's kind of hard to explain. You have to begin with the fact that he sensed that he was adopted. His parents weren't what he thought his parents should be. And he was right. I mean, his dad was a college professor. His adopted dad was a salesman. We lived in a rough neighborhood over there in Mountain View because it was transitioning between Silicon Valley people, mainly people working out at Ames Research Center, NASA, and the old, largely ethnic blue-collar neighborhood. So there was a lot of gangs and fights, and you got beat up at school and all that. Even at an early age, Steve had the willpower that he essentially, all the rest of us, we shiver in our boots because we had to go to Crittenden Junior High School and we knew we were going to get beat up. Steve said to his parents, I'm not going to junior high school here. You'll have to move. And they moved. Not many kids can pull that off, but it showed the sheer force of will, even at 11 years old. He had this sense of himself as a kind of Ubermensch, like a Superman, that there was a destiny to him, that he could assert his will over anybody. On the one hand, it made him a really awful human being to deal with. I mean, arrogant, almost solipsistic. Other people didn't really exist except for a few people that were close to him. Demanding, spoiled. And then when he founded Apple and got really rich, it just exacerbated that. I remember I interviewed him when he was just starting at Apple, when they just created it in the first building. And then a little bit later at their first headquarters, I worked with him and John Scully on the 1984 Apple Annual Report, and I saw that weird dynamic between them. The first thing he said to me when I interviewed him, I knew him from elementary school, and we talked about those days, but first thing he said to me was, have you read Thomas Kuhn's Aspects of Scientific Revolution, which is about paradigm shift? I said, yeah, I happen to have read that. And he started talking about all that. He was literally, when he would meet people, he would take it right to this kind of philosophical, metaphysical plane about changing the world and all of this kind of stuff. That was impressive. His personality was quite unpleasant. I had dinner with him once. We went out and sat sushi, and he leaned across the table. I was interviewing him for my first book, and he said, people think I'm an asshole, don't they? There was a sense of, he knew himself. He knew how people perceived him, but he didn't care because he knew where he was going. The greatest thing that ever happened to him was meeting Steve Wozniak, because Steve Jobs was not a true technologist. He couldn't program. He might be able to solder a motherboard, but he didn't really understand the guts of the Apple I. What he understood was that Steve Wozniak was a genius. Even though Woz was 3 or 4 years older than Jobs, Steve really manipulated him, controlled him. He was kind of Svengali-esque about getting Steve to do stuff. And on one hand, you can say, well, that's terribly manipulative of one human being to another. But on the other hand, Steve Jobs made Steve Wozniak one of the most famous people on earth. Wozniak would have ended up following his father's lead and become a mid-level engineer at the calculator division of Hewlett-Packard Company and retired after 45 years. Instead, he became a legend, and it was all due to Steve Jobs. Jobs did terrible things with him. I mean, he went to Nolan Bushnell and said, I can devise at Atari and said, I can build a video game for you. He couldn't do that. He couldn't do any of it. He couldn't write a line of code, I don't think, at that point. Bushnell laughed and said, okay, I'll give you so much money. Jobs immediately called Woz, got Woz to leave work at HP every evening and spend the night at Atari designing this game. Jobs presented it to Bushnell as his creation. Bushnell paid him a certain amount of money. He misrepresented the amount of money to Wozniak and gave him a fraction of it. So he pocketed most of it.
I think it was Breakout.
Yeah, this is bad stuff.
But I think the game was Breakout, actually.
Yeah, it was Breakout. There was karma in there, too, because just a few months later, Woz was building the Apple I prototype at the Homebrew Computer Club. He went up to WestCon in San Francisco, wanted to buy an Intel 8086, which had just come out. He really wanted, because he knew the power of that microprocessor, but he didn't have enough money. So he went up into one of these suites in a hotel near the convention center there. There was a company selling seconds of this clone TI microprocessor. They were like $10 a piece. He literally reached into a fishbowl and grabbed the one you wanted. That's what Woz used to build the Apple I. It was an extraordinary accomplishment that he actually built that amazing computer with that crappy microprocessor. But the company, Apple, paid for that all the way until the Macintosh because the machines were always underpowered. What did Steve bring to the party? He brought with it. He understood marketing. He understood branding. He understood design. He had this incredible capacity to assimilate design work being done in Europe and certain parts of the United States on other types of products like kitchen appliances. He looked at Italian appliance design and then he said, well, that's what we want. We don't want to do a wood or metal enclosure for the Apple II. We want to have plastic injection molding. In many ways, he would design things for himself, but he was so in tune to his generation, to my generation, that he could map his own desires onto all of us. He took the lead in innovation, at least every other part but the core technology, the chip level technology. He led the world in that. Everybody had to follow from that point on. He got driven out because he was impossible to deal with. The famous story where he went up to Xerox PARC and looked at all the work that had been done on Windows, bit mapping, and all that stuff Doug Engelbart had done. The story is he went in, looked at it, and went back to Apple and said, we need to do that. In a sense, theoretically, stole the idea from Xerox PARC and created the Macintosh and the Lisa. The reality was the design team for the Macintosh, which he wasn't in charge of, he was doing Lisa, had already been up there many times, seen it, and said, we got to put this on our new machines. And everybody said, well, if Steve doesn't think it was his idea, it won't happen. So they set Steve up to go up there. They had all the stuff kind of in a position where he'd see it all, then think that he took it back to Apple. Dealing with him was a really difficult task.
I've not heard that one before. That's fun.
But then he got sick. He got real sick. He got pancreatic cancer. I mean, it's a miracle. He lasted, 15 years? That was incredible. It changed him. And the turning point really was that graduation speech he gave at Stanford University, where for the first time, he didn't pull this, I'm the Ubermensch, I'm the Superman stuff. He talked about what the illness had done to him and hadn't necessarily made him more empathetic for other people. He still park his car and in people's way, to drive down wrong way down the exit of the Apple garage and yell at people if they went the right way, and didn't get a license plate for his car. He was still a difficult human being, but something had happened to his understanding of the fragility of life and the needs of individuals. And it propelled him into something very special. The Steve Jobs between 2000 and 2010 may have been the greatest businessman in Silicon Valley history, maybe anywhere, but certainly the most innovative. I mean, we typically say the Hewlett-Packard HP of the 1950s was the most innovative and enlightened company of all time and all that. But Jobs, remember, in the course of a decade, Steve Jobs created 3 what will be trillion-dollar business categories, product categories. Started with the iPod in 2001, literally right after 9/11, they introduced the iPod. Then he comes out, he takes over the music industry and transforms that. Then we get the iPad. Every time the market starts catching up in one area, he explodes into another one. We've never seen that kind of consistent innovation in a company that big. It's literally the most innovative large company in history. And he did it, as your friend told you, because he created an environment where you were punished not for risk taking, like most big, careful corporations, conservative corporations. Steve punished people for not taking risks enough. When you went in there to make that presentation to him of a new product idea, you had better have a damn creative solution. You had better be pushing the envelope on what this new technology is. If you show any sign of being careful or of being risk averse, you were dead in the water. I have never known a company ever, even in this town. You see that philosophy in startups. You don't see that in multi-billion-dollar corporations. That 10-year span is easily the most phenomenal I've ever seen, and probably the most phenomenal one anybody's ever seen in the business world.
When I look back on it, and I buying my first Mac, I think it was 89 or 91, I immediately loved the products and I loved the design aspects, and that just kept going on till this day. I think the key word there is love. Is like people really do love these products. And I've talked about this with other guests on this show, the comparison of walking into a mall and seeing the Apple store and the Microsoft store. No one loves anything in a Microsoft store. They're absolutely like in some kind of orgasmic state in an Apple store. It's nuts. It's nuts what he created, that feeling.
He did it all too, because he put the thing in glass. There's no traditional structure inside the store, and there are these geniuses coming to help you. He was willing to change the paradigm every step along the process, from design to marketing to retail, on and on and on.
He made people feel like they were at Disney World for computers.
Yeah, he made people feel special. If you remember back the time you bought your first Macintosh, you'd walk into a computer store, walk into Fry's or something. All the other computers looked exactly the same. They were ugly. They weren't fun, and they weren't good looking, and there was no cachet to having them. That's because they were designed by traditional companies trying to squeeze out the highest profit margins. Jobs, he had learned at the knee of H&P, realized that if you create the superior product in an industry, you can charge an additional delta on the price. That's why Apple computers were always more expensive than everything else out there. But they carried with them all of this penumbra of, I've got a cool computer, I'm an Apple person. All of that stuff he created around the products. And that was brilliant. Of course, over time, it would catch up with him, because when you have 500 PC companies and one Apple, and Apple's created this gated community where all the suppliers, you can't clone anything, you can't sell Apple software separately, all this kind of stuff. The PC world, there's all these competitors and everything else. I remember going into Fry's in the late 90s, and there'd be one aisle of Apple products, and the rest of the store was PC stuff. Eventually, you start losing market share, and that's what happened all through the beginning of the 90s under Scully. He kept trying to use the Pepsi model. Jobs comes back in the beginning of 2000 and reasserts it, but he couldn't do it with the PC with the Macintosh anymore. He had to create new markets, and that was part of his genius too. When he died, I wrote his obituary in the Wall Street Journal. One of the things I predicted was that Apple would soon become, under Tim, would become even more profitable, bigger, and gain more market share than ever before. Because having Steve leave removed that chaotic element in the organization. Now Apple could be run in a more rational business manner. But I also predicted that the company would never, ever be as innovative again. I think the last decade has proven me pretty much right.
We've had incremental advances, very cool incremental advances, but nothing that's wowed you.
Right. There's no longer that moment where, I was at the famous Macintosh introduction at Flint Center at De Anza Community College. Steve had that first Macintosh underneath a sheet and he pulled it off and it said hello to the audience. And he literally did that and now for something else. That was part of the magic act. You can put on the turtleneck, look like that middle-aged successful businessman and trying to be hip, but I haven't seen anything earth-shattering. I wanted the watch to be that kind of thing. It's nice, but it's not changing the world. Steve Jobs changed the world.
Very cool stuff. You've had an interesting seat at the table. I could continue to pick your mind.
Someday I'll tell you about Pierre Omidyar, Jeff Skoll, and I sitting at a card table with a case of Jolt Cola. And they're telling me about this new auction site they had created called eBay.
Listen, we'll do part 2 for sure.
I told them it would never work, and I didn't like the name.
Well, they got a nice cash out on that one.
Yeah, now I watch Jeff Skoll's movies coming out of Hollywood, winning all the Academy Awards.
The book, The Autonomous Revolution, Reclaiming the Future We've Sold to Machines. Kind of a 2-part conversation here, retrospective on some fun Apple stuff, but kind of laying out the serious perspective that we should all consider. And I should say the book is quite dense. You really get into the nitty-gritty here. We've kind of given a cursory overview of what people should be thinking about right now and the future, because look, it's going to be up to us. If we just let it keep unfolding, there can be some pretty serious negative downsides. You guys really do a nice job of kind of opening people up to the potentials.
It'll scare the hell out of you, but at the end, we give you hope.
Hey, is there a website we can send people to, Michael? Was there any place in particular beyond Amazon to buy the book when they can and all that stuff? But
you can go to Amazon. You just look up Autonomous Revolution. Bill Davidow, my co-author, he created a site for it. The publisher Barrett Keeler's done the same thing. Okay,
cool. Hey, thank you for your time today. Great stuff. Again, I don't know if it's, I don't want to say jealous, maybe envious, but I just think at my age now, looking back as a guy who was playing around on an Atari 2600 in the mid 70s, looking back and like, gosh, growing up on the other side of the country, what a fun place to be starting in the 70s, 80s and Silicon Valley. Just an amazing time to see everything unfolding.
Well, next time we'll talk about Silicon Valley and I'll tell you some stories about the early days of Atari.
I will prep very, very hard because I think I could come up with a lot of stuff to keep you that will kind of unpack all those memories for you.
Let's do it.
Okay. Hey, take care. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.